What's going on, everybody? Noah from Stage 3 Motorsports here, and today I wanted to sit down and kind of run through some news on the new Global Ranger that we've seen revealed, as well as the Ranger Raptor, and take a look at these trucks, give you guys some first thoughts, first impressions, and sort of put together a wish list of things that I hope that we'll see for the Ranger coming to the US. And for those of you that don't know, Ford basically confirmed through their CEO, Jim Farley, that the new Ranger and Ranger Raptor will be coming to the United States, but that's probably going to be in 2023, and it may not be exactly the same as what we're seeing overseas, but there's a lot of good information from the Australian market on these rigs, so that's where I pulled a lot of info from, and I think this will be just kind of a fun way to look ahead and try and predict what we might see when that truck makes it here to our soil. With that being said, there's a lot of info to go through. Like I said, I'm going to talk about both the regular Ranger and the Ranger Raptor, so buckle up, get comfortable, and we'll run through everything here. I'm going to cover as many details as I can. I'm sure there'll be some stuff that I miss, but I'll also have time codes in the description that you can use to skip around or find the sections that are relevant or that you want to hear about. So with that being said, let's kick things off by talking about the exterior styling on the regular new Ranger and just kind of how Ford revamped that and freshened up the look a little bit. Right off the bat, I'll say that the current generation Ranger that we have here in the US isn't a terrible looking truck. I like the styling quite a bit, and the real big hang-up was mostly that you could tell it was the older T6 platform just adopted and moved over to the US, and it was kind of an afterthought, it felt like, in the way that Ford got everything going here, and they just saw the market running away with the Tacoma and wanted some sort of competitor, even for the Colorado and everything as well. So didn't look bad, but it does kind of show its age a little bit, and I think that this new redesign that we're seeing on the Global Ranger is much, much better. A lot of people have attributed it to being kind of like a bulked up Maverick, which is pretty accurate. The grille design is very similar with that bar cutting through and the C-bar headlights and everything. I do think it's an improvement over what the Maverick has going on. The Maverick front end is a little bland, and I don't like the proportions that much. It's not terrible, but I think the Ranger capitalizes on this a lot more nicely, and the headlight shape is a little more familiar. It kind of reminds me of the previous generation of F-150 or like the Super Duty, kind of C-bar shape to the lights, especially with the DRLs in there. And I like that they bulked up the badge in the grille and kind of made the bar a little more substantial as well. Everything feels like it got scaled up slightly or was just proportioned a little bit better to the front of this truck. There's an interesting sort of H pattern that they have, which is really noticeable when you have the sport trims, or what will probably be like an FX4 trim here, where you get that dark metallic gray as sort of an accent piece instead of everything being paint matched. But I do really like the front end. I think it's very clean, very sharp. And then the sides and the back have been reworked a little bit as well. They added some bigger concave sections in the doors where it seems to be cut in a little bit further than on the current gen, and it makes the fenders look a little more bulged out and adds some more visual depth. And there's a line that traces from that back to the bedside a little bit. And all of that just is simple little design changes that I don't know that a lot of people will notice, but I do think it gives the truck a little more presence. And the vehicle did get slightly bigger for this generation as well, so I'm sure that has a little to do with it. And then working around to the back, it's very simple from the rear end. There's not a whole lot of detail or crazy changes going on there, but I do like that they didn't over stylize it. And really that could be said for most of the stuff on this truck. It's not super overdone with crazy like little vents and wings and fins and stuff all over it. It's pretty conservative, which I'm a fan of. I think it'll make it a little more timeless. But yeah, the rear gate looks good. It's got the big Ranger letters stamped in there. The taillight design reminds me of just like a regular old school phone handset, that kind of hook shape to it as well. It's a lot more nicely designed than the current generation of Ranger. The taillight options are a little weird on the current gen, and some of the LED trim that they did in there is really disjointed and odd on the current version. So I think that this was a good upgrade that just simplifies it and is more cohesive to the design of the whole truck, and it doesn't look like they were trying to just force updated pieces into an old design. Another interesting little note here is that there seems to be two different headlight types depending on the package or trim level of truck that you have. One, I think, is a halogen or LED reflector, and then the other is an LED projector light, which will obviously be on the Lariats and the higher trim or higher spec vehicles. So hopefully they're both LED, because even an LED reflector is going to be quite a bit better than just bare bones halogen, and some of Ford's halogen headlights have been pretty awful in recent years. Even on our F-150 here, they're not great. So we'll see how that works out, but I don't mind them having two different versions. Just hopefully they're both effective, and they both look nice. But with that being said, the XL bare bones work truck spec version of this generation of Ranger also looks really good. I love it with the Steelies on there, no additional body cladding or anything, and even with it just being an all white, I think it's super clean. It looks pretty rugged, and overall, I hope that a lot of the styling carries over to the new generation here in the US, because I think they knocked it out of the park with this, and it's just a huge step up from what we have currently. So there will be folks that disagree. I have to say this in every video because it's one of those beauty in the eye of the beholder things. And if you don't like it, you don't like it. That's fine. But I do think that this is a move in the right direction for Ford. Moving on from the regular Ranger styling to talking about the Ranger Raptor in terms of looks, I just want to cover a few of the things they changed here. And right off the bat, the look of the Raptor is obviously quite a bit more imposing and a little more bulked up and aggressive than even the regular Ranger. And there's a lot of styling cues and design things here that have carried over from the F-150 Raptor and the Bronco Raptor and really that whole nameplate, and they've kind of got it down to a science for a certain look that they want in the Raptor lineup. So the first thing right off the bat is the giant black grille with the huge Ford letters across there, which I think looks really nice, and the way the letters are scaled, they kind of fit within where the bar would be on the regular Ranger grille, and it hooks into the lights, and then the lights are all blacked out, so you get a really wide kind of solid block bar front end that, like I said, feels very imposing and looks very rugged. Then with that, interesting little side note is that in some of the images, if you look close at the very top of that grille, you can see 3 little cutouts where there would normally be 3 little amber lights because the Raptors are usually so wide that they have to have marker lights to be street legal. I don't know if this is because this Raptor isn't wide enough to hit that regulation or if it's because it's Australian and they have different regulations there in terms of street legality, but there doesn't seem to be any amber lights on the front. I'll be shocked if this thing makes it to the US and doesn't have amber in there because that's become such a staple over here. But I just thought it was interesting to note because you can see where the cutouts are, and I don't think Ford would put them there for no reason. Some of the other stuff that's changed is obviously the Raptor style bumper that meets the larger bulged fenders with the fender flares on the ends of those. And then you've got the silver bash plate and then what looks like 2 cutouts for tow hooks to poke through. But once again, if you look closely at some of the images that I've seen, there's actually just caps there instead of tow hooks, so I don't know if they just didn't have the hooks in for this pre-production model or what Ford was planning there. I imagine there'll have to be some sort of recovery point there because it seems crazy that Ford wouldn't add that, and that's pretty typical across the Raptor lineup now. But overall, the front end does look really solid, and then you are getting some sort of fog light in the bumper corners as well, which isn't always the case for Raptor. So there's a lot of good equipment there. It looks really nice. You've got a little bit more of a steep approach angle to the truck. And then, like I said, with the bulged fenders on the sides and the flares, it really kind of sends home that Baja desert running high-speed look. And I think that that look is good on pretty much any truck. The Bronco was the only one where they flared the fenders and it looked a little weird. But on this and all the generations of F-150, it's always just really amped up the styling quite a bit. Then with that, there's not a ton of changes around the back. The truck mostly looks the same as a regular Ranger aside from the wider stance, but it does have a slightly different taillight design. And then there does seem to be sort of a Raptor specific bumper with dual exhaust poking out. So once again, a little more sporty, a little more stylized, but still very true to the Ranger styling that they already revealed in the original Ranger. So there's a lot of good stuff going on there. I also like some of the details like the little heat extractor vents on the hoods and the fenders, which is very similar to the F-150. And then in all of the promo shots I've seen here, it's got the big Raptor decal on the back with the code orange paint and everything else. So it looks a lot like a sort of cartoon version of the current Gen 3 Raptor here in the US. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but just because everything's scaled down, it's got this like chunky Hot Wheels car sort of characteristic to the way that it looks. So I'm a big fan. Once again, like the regular Ranger, I should say, or the T6 platform. Hopefully this doesn't get altered too much by the time it makes it to the US because I do like what Ford has going on here. All right, I think I've talked enough about the styling and the looks on these trucks. So now I want to dive into talking about the regular Ranger and some of the changes that happened to the chassis and suspension. And then we'll also go into a little bit of the off-road equipment and some of the updates that they did there. So right off the bat, the regular Ranger is built on a new updated version of the T6 platform, which the T6 platform is what has been the foundation for the Global Ranger in the current generations, and it's what everybody's gotten used to seeing, and that's what our current US Ranger was based on as well. But with the new version, they've stretched it out so it's about 2 inches longer, and it also got a 2-inch wider track width to it. So overall, dimensionally, it's a little bigger and has a little more presence. And it sounds like Ford did that just to kind of help with stability and both on and off-road control. Then On top of that, they've also shifted the front wheels forward a little bit further. I'm sure it's really not going to be that noticeable of a difference, but we'll see once we actually get our hands on one and see how the US spec turns out. Now, with that being said, the other thing that they altered that was kind of notable is that they moved the rear shocks to the outside of the frame instead of the inside of the frame. Once again, I think it has something to do with just the stability and control of the truck, both on and off-road, but I imagine the ride is going to be very similar and still very comfortable. So kind of interesting changes. It'll at least make it a little easier to swap the rear shocks out, because on the current US Ranger, it is a little bit of a pain in the butt with them being tucked on the inside and having a spare tire in there. You got to fight to get around it a little bit. Not the end of the world, but just a nice little change to note. Now, the other thing, which at the time of filming this, I wasn't able to find dead set numbers on, is the towing capacity. So you guys can drop something in the comments if you have updated information or if you've seen something, but as far as I can tell, it should be either the same or slightly better than the current generation Ranger, which the 2020 Ranger is capable of towing 3,500 pounds as standard without any sort of upgrades. And then if you do the towing package, supposedly you can get up to 7,000 pounds towing capacity on that truck. So I imagine those numbers are going to be very similar on the new version, but we'll see what Ford says or what people are able to find out. And certainly if people are able to get them and start doing towing reviews and towing tests, we'll find out how capable it actually is. That's one area where that longer wheelbase, even though it's a small change, will probably be a lot more helpful. It's going to just give it that little bit more control when pulling heavier trailers. And I don't know that a ton of people are towing with Rangers nonstop and that's their primary towing vehicle, but it does give the truck a little more utility. Now, talking in terms of the off-road equipment and updates, there isn't a ton of new stuff I was able to find here. It seems like the off-road capability is going to be very similar to what we've seen in the current generation of Ranger, which is not a bad thing. I'll actually put a little link up in the corner that you guys can check out if you want to see our review on our 2019 Ranger when we took it bone stock up to Sedona. But yeah, that truck was way more capable than I expected and was very planted and pretty sure-footed. And there was only a few things that we really wanted to change after doing that review to make it a little more comfortable off-road. But overall, it definitely proved that out of the box, you could get places and actually wheel that truck. So the new Ranger should be able to capitalize on a lot of the things that they got right in the previous generation. But one of the main things right off the bat is that I'm guessing in the US versions, we're probably going to see some similar packages to what we have currently, where you could spec out an XLT Ranger with an FX4 package on top of that, or Lariat with FX4 or whatever, or just have standard four-wheel drive versions with open diffs. So there'll probably be some weird varieties and weird ways to spec these out. Ford makes that kind of confusing, I think, a lot of times for people to keep up with, to know how to get the options that they want. But FX4 usually adds in the skid plates and rear locker, and then obviously the badging and some different like little painted accessories and things on the outside. So that seems to be kind of the direction they've gone with what I can see in the Australian Rangers. They just don't have the same names or the same trim packages. But hopefully we'll see something along those lines. I'm sure there's going to be an option for a locking rear diff and all of that within it. Now, there is one change that's pretty significant to me that maybe you guys have had experience with if you are Ranger owners, but they've changed up the dial and the selection for the four-wheel drive on the inside. And a lot of this has to do with just general interior changes to the truck, which we'll talk about later. But the dial now is a lot more similar to what you get in the Bronco, which is a very good thing, because the problem I've ran into with the current gen Ranger is that that little dial sits up by the shifter, kind of towards the dashboard at the front of the console area, and there's a bucket there where you can plug in your phones and charge things, and it's really easy to just bump that dial and spin it around, and you have to rotate it to go from 2 to 4-wheel drive. So I've found myself multiple times ending up just accidentally turning it or spinning it, reaching for a wallet or some sort of item that's sitting in there, and it won't immediately slam you into 4-wheel drive, or if you're going 75 down the highway, it's not going to take you into 4 low, but then once you stop, it will wait and try and make those changes or move the truck in and out of 2 or 4, and it's just a small annoyance that is kind of a pain in the butt, especially if you are out wheeling and you accidentally tick it back into 2-wheel drive or whatever that may be. So it's one of those things I've ran into a few times, but with the position of this new dial, they've scooted it back, and now it's a push button on the top to select 2 or 4 high or 4 low, whatever it may be, and you have a little more control with it, and there's less chance to bump it from what I can tell. So once again, maybe sounds like a small, stupid thing, but for me, I think it's a huge improvement, and it just kind of reduces the risk of screwing something up or making things unnecessarily hard off-road. With that, there also seems to be the selectable ring around the outside, but like the Bronco, this is going to choose some different drive modes. And I don't think they're going to be quite as crazy or played up as the GOAT modes that the Bronco has, but we will probably be seeing some different versions from what I can tell, where you can adjust for like rocky or sandy terrain, or you can throw the truck into sport mode and it's just going to alter things like the throttle response or alter the way that the traction control interacts, or maybe even steering and stuff like that. So that stuff is nice to have, and some of those do make a decently significant difference in the way the truck feels and drives. I think they continue to refine this technology every year and with every iteration of these vehicles, which is why we see this all the time in the Raptor variants and in the Bronco and everything else. So that should give this truck a little bit more of a competitive edge over the current Ranger, but I'll wait to pass any judgment on that until I get a chance to actually try it. Overall, once again, I think Ford's moving in the right direction here, and there's some good stuff that's going to make this truck very capable right out of the box without having to spec it out like crazy or go straight to the Raptor. Let's keep the ball rolling, and we'll move on to talking about the chassis and suspension and some of the off-road equipment changes for the Ranger Raptor. And obviously, with this new Raptor being based on the new Global Ranger platform, some of the previous changes I talked about have carried over, and there's a lot of similarities there. But Ford also takes the Raptor nameplate very seriously now, and they've been making some serious alterations to every vehicle that gets the Raptor name. We saw this with the Bronco, we've seen it with the Gen 3 F-150 Raptor as well, and the Ranger is no exception. They've got in there and tweaked quite a bit to make this truck a lot more capable. And one of the first things that's kind of a staple, and I mentioned it a bit in the styling, is the wider track width and the bulged fenders and kind of an overall change to the stance of the vehicle, because with that Raptor platform, having a wider track width makes it a lot more stable at high speeds, especially when you're bombing across the desert at 60 or 70 miles an hour, hitting whoops and things like that, or even when just like sliding the truck in the dirt and doing donuts and things like they've shown in the promo footage. You want the vehicle to stay a lot more planted, so the less narrow it is, the less chance that there is that it's going to catch and roll. So with that being said, I, at the time of filming this, was not able to find any specs on exactly what the width is of the Ranger Raptor. I'm sure that stuff's going to roll out fairly soon, and we'll get some better info on the dimensions and the ride height and ground clearance and everything like that. But right now, I haven't been able to find any of it. It is clearly quite a bit wider than the regular T6 or the regular Global Ranger, but we'll see what happens. If you guys do find those specs or are able to drop them in the comments, or if I see them, I'll throw them down there so we can share that with everybody. Anyway, some of the other stuff that changed is things pertaining to the frame and the suspension setup in terms of the actual shock towers and frame mounts for the shocks. They reinforced certain sections of the frame to give it some better strength and a little more durability, so that way if you do jump this thing or you're really hammering it across the desert, you're not going to warp it or bend it or crack the frame, get taco truck going on. So that stuff is pretty standard now for the Raptor. We've seen this, like I said, in the other platforms. And then they've also changed up the rear suspension quite a bit from the regular Ranger. And I forgot to mention this when we were talking about the standard Ranger, but that truck is sitting with coilovers up front and leafs in the rear, whereas the new Raptor Ranger is going to be coils on all four corners. So the back end's a little different, and it's also a Watts link in the rear. So you still have a live axle, but it's going to have a little better articulation and some better control off-road. And I'm kind of surprised that they didn't just go with coils on all four corners for the regular Ranger, but it does make sense that they changed it here, especially because they made this same change to the F-150 with the Gen 3 Raptor as well. All of that stuff's good to see. And then on top of that, the other thing that's carried over from the other Raptors that we've seen is the Fox live valve suspension. Now, when you look at the Bronco and the F-150, those are all running 3.0s or 3.1 inch shock bodies, which is referring to the diameter of the body, which is why they look so much larger than the factory equipment. And then obviously you have a spring that's calibrated to the vehicle as well, and some external resis and things like that. With the Ranger, they're not actually 3.0s, they're a 2.5, but it's still got all the live valve goodies, and it's still quite a bit bigger than what you'd have on the regular standard version of the Ranger. I think the 2.5s are an excellent shock for this, and honestly, in my experience, just running Fox's aftermarket 2.5 kit on our current spec US Ranger, it performed excellent. I love that suspension, had a great feel off-road, and it certainly amped up the capability of a truck that wasn't even a Raptor platform to start. So I wouldn't say that that truck is going to run the same way that this new Raptor can off-road, but it does kind of give me a bit of promise and hope that the Ranger Raptor will really be able to kind of run with the best of them. And if you guys aren't familiar, the live valve stuff that comes with this that I was talking about is basically the ability to electronically adjust the suspension characteristics on the fly. So you'll see that there's like some little electrical connectors or solenoids and things that go into the shock body. Those are all channeled up to a button in the cab, and you can basically dial in the vehicle to adjust for like a firmer or softer off-road ride, depending on if you're doing more Baja driving or rock crawling or however you're using the vehicle at that current point in time. So it gives you a lot of customization there to really dial in the vehicle for how you want to use it, which I think is awesome. And then on top of all of this, they've also made some changes like swapping to aluminum upper and lower control arms that are a bit more durable, a little lighter than what you would have on the standard Ranger 2. Overall, there's a lot of great changes here. I think this looks awesome. It's very promising for this next generation of Ranger Raptor, and I'm certainly thrilled that we're going to be seeing this here on US soil. So I expect that we'll probably see this exact equipment, if not something very, very similar here over in the US. I can't imagine them putting all this time and effort and research in to not bring the truck over here, especially because they do want it to be a global platform. So I am looking forward to that, and perhaps in the next iteration or in maybe a bit of a mid-cycle refresh for the Raptor, we'll see a larger 3.0 suspension or something like that in there. Who knows, but the 2.5 should be plenty good. The other thing I do want to talk about is some of the other off-road equipment that's tied into the Raptor package. One of the main things is obviously there's a huge bash plate on the front, which is very typical for Raptor, but it also has a whole other suite of skid plates underneath. They're all steel, good protection for the motor, transmission, transfer case, stuff like that. So just in case you do catch a rogue rock or you're in some really harsh terrain where the breakover angle for a truck is not quite suited to it, you've got a little protection to get you by. And then, of course, we've got front and rear lockers on this rig. There's also 7 different drive modes for it. One of those is Baja mode, which is specific to the Raptor platform. And these drive modes are kind of like what I was talking about earlier with the Bronco's GOAT modes, or even the different drive modes in the regular standard Ranger. So you're going to be able to alter things like the way the traction control performs, or in this case, even some of the characteristics of the suspension and the steering. You're going to get different throttle inputs. Something else that I thought was interesting in terms of off-road equipment is that this truck seems to have a 17-inch wheel on there that's a Raptor-specific wheel for this package, and it looks nice, but it also looks like it's running around a 33-inch BFG KO2, which the KO2 has kind of been the standard go-to tire for Raptor packages. It's a great tire, and 33 is a pretty nice size for this truck. I am just a little surprised that it's actually not bigger, which I could be wrong, and maybe it is a larger tire. It's really hard to tell because we don't have the specs at the time of filming this, but I think it'll get the job done, no problem, and it seems proportional. And obviously the Ranger Raptor here doesn't have the same kind of wheel well space that like a Bronco does to just slam 37s on it, and I think that's probably overkill for this truck. But I'll be curious to see if Ford bumps that up to something closer to a 34 or tries to beef it up a little bit more from what the factory size would be. But I know for a lot of folks, and even us here with our US spec Ranger, getting to a 33 was already a pretty big step up from what the truck came with, and especially with it being a nice tire like a KO2, you're getting a lot better mechanical traction. There's a lot more to work with there. So even if it still maintains this exact same wheel and tire combo, it's going to be a nice little bump up over what you would get in just a regular bare bones packaged Ranger. Let's move on from talking suspension and off-road equipment, and we'll move back to the regular standard Ranger. And I want to talk a bit about the powertrain options and some of the motors and stuff, which I will say at the time of filming this, there isn't a whole lot to go off in terms of a US spec Ranger because we just don't have that information. So this is more speculation here than anything else, but to give you guys an idea, the Aussie Rangers seem to come with a whole slew of different diesel options. One of them is a 3-liter V6 diesel that I think is going to be new for this generation over there, and I'll touch on why that is significant in a little bit. But one of the other things I've seen is that in other markets around the world, they're going to be using the 2.3-liter EcoBoost 4-cylinder, which is the same motor we have in the US spec Ranger here, but it's also the same motor that you can get in the Bronco, and it's even the same motor generally as the one that's in the Mustang over here. So this is a pretty widely used engine by Ford, and it's actually an engine that I like quite a bit. My first experience with it was with our 2019 Ranger, and I was super impressed with the power it made, and we've had no reliability issues with it or any hiccups. It's actually pretty fuel efficient, and it does a good job of working with mods. Once you add a bit of weight or a little more lift and a larger tire, it can kind of combat that rolling resistance pretty well. So I'm happy with it. I think it's a great engine for these pickups, and I've liked it in the Bronco as well. And the fact that they're going to be bringing that to other markets around the world is a pretty good signal that that's going to be the motor that we get in the US version. So I'm perfectly happy with that. So the reason I touched on that 3-liter V6 that they're getting in Australia is because Ford is trying to future-proof this truck a little bit. And it seems like they're providing enough space in the engine bay that obviously they can get a V6 diesel in there, but they want to have other options to add different powertrains down the road. And this could mean that maybe in the US we'll have an option for a 2.7-liter EcoBoost V6, which is that larger V6 for the Bronco or the smaller V6 for the F-150, but it's another twin turbo, really nice motor. I've been super happy with the 2.7 with my experience with it in the F-150s and even now in our Badlands Bronco. It's a great motor and it would make for a nice step up for somebody that wanted a little bit more power out of the Ranger and wanted to jump up from just the regular 4-cylinder. So I don't know that that will happen. Ford didn't give us any other options here in the US than just the 2.3-liter 4-cylinder for the current gen. So we'll see how willing they are to pile in different powertrains in the new version. But the fact that it could accommodate it, I think, is an interesting thing to touch on. Obviously, the other part of this is not just what motor you're going to get in your Ranger, but what kind of transmission is going to be paired to it. And I'm going to be shocked if Ford does anything other than a 10-speed auto here. That's just become the standard for all of their vehicles. It's what the Bronco gets unless you spec a manual. It's what the F-150s have. It's kind of their go-to transmission, which once again, I have no problems with. I actually do really like the 10-speed. I think it's a great performer both on and off-road for the most part. It is a little annoying to try and cycle through those gears and you don't have as much control over it in terms of off-road, so I find it harder to engine brake and you can't really move through it and control the vehicle the same way. But they correct for some of that with like downhill assist and different little technical add-ons and electrical things that are built into the truck. So that stuff is there, but overall it's a pretty dependable transmission and Ford clearly has put a lot of time into R&D with it. So I'm almost certain that's what we're going to see here. The other interesting thing to note is that from what I can tell in Australia on some of the more bare bones work truck spec vehicles, if you've got the 2-liter diesel, there is a 6-speed manual option that can be paired to that. So I could be wrong, but from what I saw, that was the case. And then you could also do a 6-speed auto there. I don't think we'll see the 6-speed auto here, but a manual would be really awesome. I was super thrilled that they did a manual in the Bronco, and I thought that that drove amazing. It's a lot of fun to have a very modern, tight-feeling manual transmission in a new vehicle. So I don't know that the market's there. I don't foresee Ford doing it, but if they could bring that over, even if you could only pair it to the 2.3, I think that would be a really cool upgrade. One last thing I'll touch on with Powertrain, which I've seen a lot of people mention in different news outlets and YouTube videos, is the fact that we will probably be seeing some sort of hybrid or maybe even an all-electric version of the Ranger down the road after Ford has gotten this current version out and people have been driving them and running them with the regular EcoBoost power options. So that would not shock me. The Maverick seems to be doing pretty well in terms of orders as a hybrid, and people are really drawn to that technology and certainly to the fuel economy with the way that fuel prices are getting, at least over here in the US. So I could see that being a very smart move for the Ranger to have a functional, good hybrid setup in there. I haven't heard anything about it yet. I don't know if anybody has any good details on if that's truly in the works, but once again, it'd be really surprising if Ford didn't touch on that. So let's shift gears real quick and talk about the powertrain option that is specific to the Ranger Raptor. And I say option, not plural, because it seems like there really is only one option that you can get, but it's not a bad thing. Ford has spec'd out the 3-liter twin-turbo V6 with anti-lag, which from the numbers I've seen from Australia is rated to crank out about 392 horse and 430 pound-feet of torque, which is crazy. And I know that you Aussies have a little bit different measurement for that stuff. I believe it's kilowatts, and that's probably been converted to get this horsepower number. So I don't know if that's dead on exact, but no matter how you cut it, 392 horse is a lot of power, as is 430 pound-feet of torque, especially in a Ranger. Those numbers would have been unheard of in the old school Ranger that we had back in the 90s or even the 80s. So it's plenty of power, and it also makes a lot of sense because this seems to be the same motor that they spec'd into the Bronco Raptor. So I imagine a lot of the equipment and the parts around that are going to be the same. They maybe will have slightly different tuning, or the compression may be different. I don't know what Ford's going to alter between the Ranger pickup and the Bronco as an SUV, but I've got high hopes. I think this is going to be a very fun motor, and it also kind of speaks to the fact that once again they've provided enough room for a turbocharged V6 to fit in that engine bay. So maybe we'll see a 2.7 in the regular Ranger. I don't know, but I do think that this is pretty cool. I like that it's a similar setup to what we're seeing in the Bronco Raptor. And then it looks like the only option is to have this paired to that 10-speed automatic, which once again is not a surprise and definitely fits in line with the rest of the Raptor lineup. So should still be a total blast. I believe that this thing's got paddle shifters and stuff too, and then obviously with the different drive modes and the ability to kind of tweak that, you'll have some more quicker, harder hitting shift modes that should really be able to juice this 3-liter turbo for everything it's got. So a lot of that is pretty exciting to see. And then another thing to note here is that the Raptor version of the Ranger also has the adjustable exhaust that we've seen on the Bronco and on the F-150. So you'll be able to dial it back or open it up depending on what kind of sound you want, which basically you have like a quiet bone stock mode where it's not going to make a lot of noise. I think there's like a middle in between mode where it's more of a sport sound. And then with the Baja mode or the off-road mode, you can just open the thing completely and, you know, blow your neighbors away or whatever. So it sounds cool from the sound clips. Once again, I talked about this before in some of the other videos. It's really hard to know if that sound is truly that good or if it's going to sound better or worse in person because you're hearing it through headphones from a computer. But I do think it sounds decent, and I'm glad that Ford is carrying that technology over, because typically their EcoBoost V6s don't have the best exhaust note, and the 3.5 I've always thought was a pretty terrible sound. So it should be a big improvement here and will make this truck just a little more fun to drive and maybe a little bit more livable day to day. That's about all there is to say in terms of powertrain on the Raptor as far as what I know right now and what's been released. But let's scoot on, moving away from powertrain, and we can focus in on all of the interior redesign, which kind of covers both the new Ranger T6 platform and the Raptor because they carry pretty much the same interior. From what I can tell looking at these photos and some of the video that Ford released, the interior on the Ranger is entirely new. They've redesigned everything, and it really is a godsend because honestly, with the current gen Ranger that we have here in the US, I felt like the interior was probably the area it was lacking the most. It's still plenty comfortable, and I've had no issues driving that Ranger. When we built it, it was plenty good for road trip miles, but it always felt like it was from 2008, even though it just landed here in 2019. A lot of the bubbly styling and some of the plastics and things just didn't really hold up, and not in terms of durability, but in terms of design scrutiny. So seeing this interior now, it looks like things are a lot sharper, a little bit more modern. They've cleaned up the lines a lot, and then obviously they've updated a lot of the tech and the functionality of the interior as well. One of the things that's pretty immediately striking is the redesigned dash, and I like how it looks in some of these photos with the stitching in there, and they've got some storage pockets and things like that that they've added. But then of course you've got this huge like 12-inch touchscreen in the center, which a lot of people are saying looks a lot like the Rams or, you know, the Tesla screens or whatever else. It's one of those things that's becoming more and more common in modern vehicles, and I do think it looks cool. And what, as good as Sync is now in its current iteration, there's a lot of neat utility that can come from having a screen that big. But I will say that I still prefer the physical buttons and kind of the tactile feel where you can interact without having to look at the screen and take your eyes off the road. And you know, it's one of those things, some people like this more than others. I just think for a truck and certainly a vehicle you're going to be taking off-road, that having some dials and physical buttons to press is a lot easier to use and a lot safer than having a giant TV mounted in the dash. So it has its pros and its cons. I'm not surprised to see that it's here, but if there's a more base model version with a smaller screen that has more buttons, that's probably going to attract me a bit more than the giant Tesla screen in the center. We'll see how that works out. I imagine a lot of this stuff is going to be almost identical to what we'll see in the US spec Ranger, so I'm not predicting that there will be many changes here, other than obviously the steering wheel being shifted to the other side. One of the other things that I noticed that was kind of a cool change is that the display in the gauge cluster is now all digital. There's no actual physical or analog gauges. Everything is just entirely a screen, but this means that you get a lot of customization there, and it does open up some other unique features that you wouldn't get from a standard gauge cluster. So one of the things that comes to mind is if you've got your phone hooked up, you know, you're running Apple CarPlay and you have directions going, it'll actually feed you some of the directions right into the gauge cluster at the top, and you can get that turn-by-turn navigation, which is kind of cool. And then obviously there's a lot of customization and what kind of information you can display. So, you know, you can have your speedometer and your tach, you can pull up things like transmission temp, whatever else. So there's a lot of little detail stuff that can be done to customize the truck to the way that you use it or the kind of information that you need. And I do really like that, as opposed to being shoehorned into potentially a bad designed gauge cluster that you dislike and don't want to look at. That's kind of neat. It goes with sort of the customization and really refining these trucks to a certain driving feel that works for how you use it. Some other things to note: the actual design of the seats and the bolstering looks a little bit different than the current gen Ranger, and then obviously the design of the door panels and the pockets and the way that the handle's shaped and everything is all very refined as well, and a lot sharper and a lot more sleek. So I like the look of all of that. Some of the switches and things are pretty similar to current gen, or similar to the F-150, which is fine. They didn't change the stuff that already works well. They just kind of updated and refined the look or made certain things work better. And then another big area that's changed quite a bit from the current Ranger is looking at that little center console section. This now has a weird little shift knob that's not like a full longer shift handle like we're used to in the current spec US Ranger. And I don't think that this will be a bad thing. It all kind of serves the same purpose. Obviously, there's not a manual, at least in these images that we can see, so you're just electronically moving a switch around to select, reverse or drive, whatever it may be. So the fact that it got a little bit shorter and a little more alien looking in the truck really doesn't have anything to do with the functionality, and I don't think it looks bad. It should be plenty easy to use for what we need. And then, like I mentioned before in some of the four-wheel drive talk, the other big thing that they changed here is the placement of that dial for the four-wheel drive modes and actually switching from 2 high to 4 high and whatever else. And then they have some buttons for the terrain modes and some other equipment depending on how your truck is optioned out. And a lot of that has been scooted back kind of towards the armrest in the console, and then the cup holders are moved forward, which I really like. I think it's a way better layout. You also have the little trigger there for the electronic parking brake. So everything's pretty easy access. It looks like a smart layout. Like any of this stuff that I've mentioned, it's hard to say without actually sitting in it, but just going off my experience with the current Ranger, I think a lot of this is going to be a big improvement. And then there seems to be very similar back seat space and legroom. I think that it should still be just as comfortable as the current Ranger is. And then you'll also find that there's going to be a lot more USB and USB-C plugins and things that are in here too, to bring all of that up to date for your newer devices and whatever tech you're carrying with you. So it'll be no surprise that the Raptor variant of the Ranger capitalizes on all these same changes, and the interior looks similar but has a lot of the Raptor touches. So there's little code orange accents on the seats and in the stitching, and then you have the Raptor logo on the wheel. Then they've trimmed out some parts of the dash with that orange accent as well. All looks very sporty. The seats seem to be a different design than the actual standard Ranger seat, so you're getting bigger bolsters and a little bit more of a performance feel that should hug you a little better when you're really bombing across the desert in this thing. And they've also spent some time on the back seats, giving them a little bigger bolstering and adjusting the positioning a little bit too. So it looks like it'll be comfortable both front to back. I like all the Raptor touches. And then there's a couple other things which, if you look at the dash more head on, you can see that the steering wheel's a little bit thicker and has more of an ergonomic design. It's got the little sightline wrap around the top. And then, I'm sure there's going to be some custom modes and things within the digital displays that are Raptor specific, and some logos and colors there that you wouldn't have in the standard Ranger. So you will have another layer of customization to that. But overall, whether you're going for standard Ranger or Raptor, I think that the interior design is a big win, and it looks so much better than the current generation. So as a whole, looking at all this, I'm really excited for what this could mean for the US spec Ranger. I imagine we're going to be seeing a very, very similar interior, if not the exact same pieces. And it's really cool to see that Ford is finally giving the Ranger its due diligence to bring it up to spec with a lot of the work that they've done in their other vehicles, because the F-150 interior, the Bronco interior, and even looking into like the Maverick and some of their other newer vehicles, the design is just so much cleaner and so much more fresh than what we've had in the current gen Ranger. So it does give the sense that you're going to get more bang for your buck in terms of the quality and the tech that you have in a vehicle like this. The very last thing I want to touch on here is just talking about a few little tweaks to the Ranger's bed as it stands in terms of utility. And I know this video is running a little long and there's not much to say, so I'll power through it quick, but there's a few little things that have carried over from the F-150 and some of Ford's other vehicles. One of them is the cutouts at the top of the tailgate, so when you drop it, you can push it in and you can actually get clamps on there. So if you want to clamp down a 2x4 or whatever and cut it with the saw, you can use it more as a workbench, and it just adds an extra layer of utility to that tailgate. But the other thing I thought was interesting and notable is the fact that they've adjusted the bed dimensions and the wheel wells to give you a little more space in between the wells, to the point where they say you can fit a standard pallet in there. If that's the case, it is actually pretty handy. I don't know how many people are using a forklift to load a whole pallet of bricks or anything into the back of their Ranger, but it does give you some perspective on the amount of space that you have. And especially with the Ranger being a shorter bed overall, having a little bit more width to it can help a lot in the actual effectiveness of hauling cargo. And most people spec these out with a crew cab too, so it's not like you're really typically getting a longer bed option. Who knows what we'll see for cab and bed configurations here in the US. It would be really cool if they brought back a single cab with a longer bed so you could get some more utility, and there would definitely, I think, be a market for that in terms of people looking for fleet vehicles or construction vehicles, and something that has a little bit more workhorse capability that's a bit beefier and more truck-like than the Maverick, but isn't as excessive as an F-150 or a Super Duty if they don't need the towing or hauling capabilities. So hopefully that makes it over. I don't know if it will, because Ford hasn't really wanted to touch on single cabs with the Ranger, at least not in the current gen. But once again, they put some thought into the bed, and it looks like they're going to have some other little guides on how-tos for making your own bed accessory similar to the Maverick, or you can, at least cut some wood up and drop dividers in like a traditional pickup bed. So overall, it should be plenty functional for anybody that wants to use it like a truck. Well, I think that's going to bring us to the end of this Ranger video, and I appreciate it if you guys stuck it all the way out to the end here. I know that it was a lot of information to cover, and I'm sure there's still plenty of stuff that I didn't even mention or specs that I missed. I think that there's a lot of exciting things to look forward to here, and I know a lot of you guys are Ranger owners or are looking to buy a Ranger down the road, so hopefully this gives you a little bit of perspective on where Ford is taking that platform. But I also wanted to take a quick moment to throw in the fact that we are going to be doing another Ranger build here for Stage 3. So if you guys were fans of that 2019 Ranger that we built out, we're going to do another current gen. It won't be the new updated version yet, and we want to capitalize on a lot of the mods and some of the equipment that we weren't able to test on our previous build. So keep an eye out for that. We don't have it on hand yet, but I'm working on getting a Ranger back in the shop here as soon as we can, and it should be a lot of fun. There's still plenty that can be done with that current gen, and as I said, it's a truck that we've really grown to love here, and it should be a nice little send-off before the new Ranger makes it over here and we start to dial into some content on that new platform. That's all I've got for you guys in this one. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.